festival organizers for asking me to speak this evening. And, you know, somebody said, it's good to see you again, and I said, you know, it is good to be here, but it's good to be anywhere at my age. But it's especially good to be here among people, for example, who have the same interests and the same loves that I have. And I'm grateful to you all for your turning out to see a really old man who's slowly falling into the fund of things. I really like that expression. I wish I'd come up with that, but Wendell Berry was the one who came up with that, slowly falling into the fund of things. So I like the expression, but I'm not really too fond of the act. Yeah, right. Deliberate Shapes and Senses. I don't know who came up with that title, but they should be paid off in good books. About 1,000 of them. Tonight I want to begin with a public thank you. I want to thank all the people, for example, that I have asked over a period of years who have bowed their heads to writing. I can't enumerate them all. In 50 years, I surely can't enumerate them all. But I want to use a few of them to illustrate what some people have done whom I've asked to write. Well, first I want to tell you about 1975. A fellow by the name of Leonard Randolph, who at that time was the Artists Program Director for the National Endowment of the Arts, stood up in Kearney, Nebraska and said that they had just done an evaluation of the Poets in the Schools program around the nation. New York City came in first, California came in second, and Nebraska came in third. And so as a member of the Poets in Schools Corps at that time, I'm not only very, very grateful to the Nebraska Arts Council for giving me an opportunity to do that. I can still remember the phone call when someone, whom I've forgotten, said from Omaha, "Dr. Welch, how would you like to be a poet in the schools?" And I said, "I'd really like to be a poet in the schools." "Well, we're going to give you everything from Seward West." And somebody who's grown up in rural Nebraska, as I said, I can take it. I can take it. So Omaha was well covered, and Lincoln was well covered, and everything, I got everything from Seward West, except one time I said to Bill Clefcorn about being in Goner, "What the heck are you doing in my territory?" And if you know where that is, it's about 5 or 6 miles west of Seward. So I'm going to start with Ulysses, Nebraska. School is closed. In fact, I closed more schools in the state of Nebraska than anybody I know of. We're in a high school, which is no longer a high school. And we're in a room in which there are 5 students. Each of the students has a desk in a corner, except the boy who has his desk right by the door, because he announces to me about 10 minutes after I'm there that he has to go to the bathroom more often. So he sits by the door. We write the poems, and then we bring the poems to the center of the room, and we sit down in the center of the room, and we read each other the poems. Except I can't get the girl over there in that corner out of the corner. Her name is Tammy Cradaville. Until about Wednesday of a week-long residency, she writes this poem, she gives it to me, and I read it for her in the center of the room. And I ask the kids, "You like that poem?" And they said, "We really like this poem." I said, "Okay, let's see if we can get Cammie to come out of the corner and read it." And she slowly gets up out of the desk, and she shyly comes to the middle of the room, and she reads her poem. "I used to be invisible. I still am, as you can see. I wish I were you, and you were me." And right next to the poem, she had drawn 2 big eyes with downcast dark pupils and long black eyelashes with no face. I used to be invisible. I still am, as you can see. I wish I were you and you were me. But we got her to the center of the room on Thursday, and she was ready to go. Eddyville, Nebraska. School's now closed there, too. First day we play a game. I put on the board, I'm inside a blank. It is blank in here. It is very blank in here. I am being blank in here. And I tell these fourth graders, I said, fill in the blanks with anything you want to. So they just fill them up. And after they do about 3 or 4 of these things, and I know that I've got the rhythm in their heads, I say to them, now you can go into anything that you want to and write about it in any way that you want to write about it. So that what I'm telling them is basically, what I'm telling fourth graders is basically what I would tell anybody who wants to write, especially poetry. You feel your way into something and you word your way out. So these kids were about to feel their way into all sorts of things and word their way out. And so the papers came in at the end of the period, and I looked at this paper and I thought, my gosh, I would have never dreamed that a fourth grader would go inside this thing. I am inside a poem. I am inside the P. It is noisy in here. I'm inside the O. It is quiet in here. I'm inside the E. There is not a thing on in here. I'm inside the M. I feel good in here. So here's a kid who has felt his way into every letter in the word poem and then worded his way out. So we're in the lunchroom about 2 days later, and I said to him, how you doing, Patrick? And he said, pretty good. And Patrick and I are about ready to eat, well, I'm about ready to eat my first flying saucer. You see, even the cooks get into the poetry business. You know what a flying saucer is? It's a piece of limp bologna, or euphemistically called minced ham, on which there is a glob of mashed potatoes. On top of that is a dollop of cheese, and you're supposed to heat this, and the bologna is supposed to curl up like a flying saucer. Mine was just limp and oily, and just lay there, you know, lifeless on the plate. And Patrick, who's sitting beside me, says to me, Dr. Welch, he said, I got a secret. And I said, okay, tell me your secret. Well, I said, you can't tell anybody. And I said, okay, I won't tell anybody. But if you tell me your secret and I vow not to tell anybody, then you have to do something for me. And he said, okay. Well, I said, what's your secret? He said, I like poetry. Jeez. This is a fourth grade boy who is extremely precocious, but he discovered in the fourth grade that males are not supposed to like poetry. The males at birth get 3 chromosomes, X, Y, and P. I mean, come on. So I said, okay, Patrick, I won't tell anybody that you like poetry. And I said, what do you have to do, and what do I have to do for you? And I said, eat my flying saucer. And he didn't. He didn't, no. 5th grade, Gothenburg, Nebraska. I can get almost any kid to write. Well, there was a boy who sat right where Don is sitting, and for 3 days he just looked down at his desk. And I remember one day getting clear down on my knee and looking up into his face, and he smiled at me. But he didn't write anything. And so I said to the teacher, Bertha Dayharsh, what's up with the boy in the front row? He won't write anything. Oh, she said, I should have told you about him. He doesn't write and he doesn't speak. And we got busy and I didn't have a chance to follow up on what a boy like that would be doing in the 5th grade. But anyway, we were doing that inside game, and all of a sudden, I noticed that he was writing. And Bertha Dayharsh, bless her heart, blocked me into that wall. I mean, she just literally blocked me clear across the room into the wall. And I looked at her as if I were a 5th grader and said, Mrs. Dayharsh, could you tell me please what I have done wrong? And she looked at me and she said, he's writing. He's writing. And I said, okay, he's writing. He finished. Half the class was still writing. She went next door, got a student teacher, brought the student teacher in, and said, you take over the class. And to the kids who weren't done yet, she said, hand your papers in. And they're looking like, what do you mean? We're not even done writing. So she said, I want to see what this boy has written. Well, you can imagine what a boy's handwriting looked like who really hadn't written anything. So we played the same game the Oxfordians played with the Rosetta Stone. We went to the office. We had the school principal, the school nurse, the custodian, Bertha Dayharsh, and me. We Xeroxed up a copy of this boy's poem for each of us, and then each of us gave what we thought was a transliteration of what this boy had written. Then we collated our transliterations. And you know what we came up with? I'm inside my head. It is a disaster. It is all falling apart. There are little green men tearing it apart. I look out my eye. I see a sign which says, do not disturb. And so I said, does anyone know what happened to this kid? Why would he write something like this? And the principal said, okay, I'll tell you something in confidence, which is about to be spread all over the Nebraska if you want to take it that way. When he was 4 years old, his father came home drunk and threw people out of the house. He threw this boy, Kelly, out of his bedroom through a plate glass window, which was closed. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor. Then he screamed at the family that he never, ever wanted to see any one of them again inside the house. So I said to Mrs. Dayharsh, I'm going to run a risk. This kid has come out of his silence and he's written something. I'm going to run a risk tomorrow. So I went in class the next day and I said to people in class, have you ever had a day in which you felt so crummy that you didn't want anybody in your space? Well, hands went up all over the room. I said, somebody really wrote well about feeling that way yesterday. Would you like to hear what he wrote? And they all said, yes. So I said, here it is. I'm inside my head. It is a disaster. It is all falling apart. There are little green men tearing it apart. I look out my eye. I see a sign which says, do not disturb. Then I look at him. And he has his head on his arms down on his desk. And I thought, just for a moment, I sent him back into maybe another 5 or 6 years of silence. However, I have had so many kids come up to me with poems and say, don't read this. Or, you know, you might like to read this. And so I got clear down on one knee again, and I looked up into this kid's face, and there was the biggest smile on his face, like, my God, I'm good. I am really good. So on the last day of the week, he wrote, I used to be an old junk car, but Dr. Welch thinks I'm a Trans Am. There we go, yeah. For years I tried to find out what happened to Kelly, and he moved away from Gothenburg, so I was never ever able to follow up on him and to find out if his life hopefully became a lot better. 5th grade, Huntley, Nebraska, another closed school. Beth. I went up and put a haiku on the board, one of my favorite haikus by Beisho. The temple bell stopped, but the sound kept coming out of the flowers. The temple bell stopped, but the sound kept coming out of the flowers. I asked the kids, do you like that? Boy, they did. They really liked that. So we talked a little bit, and I told them that haiku in Japanese meant being in a place and simply feeling its presence. But a haiku is more than simply being in a place and feeling its presence. It's deliberately shaping the feeling that you feel in that place. So then I went to the board and I began erasing words in that haiku. The temple bell stopped and the sounds kept coming out of the flowers. And then I said to the kids, fill in the blanks with your own words. And Beth wrote it, came up and she said, is this what you're looking for? Their marriage stopped, but their love kept coming out of the blue. Their marriage stopped, but their love kept coming out of the blue. I think I told her something like, that's not that bad. No, that's not that bad. But there it is again. Now we jump up to high school. York, Nebraska, grade 10. You get to play him way in the back. Great big kid. I mean, here he is with these sophomores, literally in the Greek, wise morons. These wise morons who are just coming into puberty. And I look back at this kid, and he later tells me he's 6'3" and he weighs 225 pounds. Anyway, we write. He doesn't write. But he's not the only boy in class who really doesn't make an effort to write. So on Thursday of the week, I say, consider this aisle in class as being an aisle in our heads. If we go clear back down this aisle in our heads and go over this way, in that part of our hidden heads, there are extremely sad, tragic, painful things which you're not even feeling or thinking of right now. If we go down this aisle and we go over this way, there are those hilariously funny stories that they tell about you or someone in your family when you get together at family reunions. What do you want to do today? Do you want to write funny stuff or do you want to write sad stuff? They chose to write sad stuff. I said, okay. There's a clock up there. After I said this, take out a sheet of paper, pencil. There's the clock up there. See the clock? In exactly 7 minutes and 30 seconds, I want you to pull up that 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And they're all looking at me like, this is really the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. I said, no. I said, first of all, I want you to go down this aisle in your head over to something very painful or tragic that you've had happen to you or a member of your family has had happen to him or her. But when you start to write, I want you to write so fast and so uninterruptedly that in 7 minutes and 30 seconds you have filled up this 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So you can see basically what I didn't tell them. I want you to be unself-conscious. I don't want you to write and then consider what it is that you've written. I want you to write as fast as you can. In fact, I even told them, I don't care about punctuation, complete sentences, or anything. Once you start to write, you write anything that comes into your head. So they did. Dan, in 7 minutes and 30 seconds, I said, stop. Well, some of them had this much on the paper, some of them had gone clear down the paper and onto the back. But I said, whatever it is that you have enough to do what we're now going to do. So someone asked William Faulkner one time, where do you get these ideas for your stories? And Faulkner tapped his temple and he said, oh, there's a lot of lumber in this attic. We had our lumber in the garage. You had to take it out of the garage, you had to measure it, you had to cut it, but first of all, you had to have some idea, some feeling of what it was that you were making. So I said, do this for me. Now go back and read what you've written and circle only what you consider to be the good stuff. And they looked at me like, good stuff? I said, yeah, any good stuff that you can find, just draw a circle around it. So they did. They circled words, they circled phrases, they circled complete sentences, they circled passages. And I said, if you can do this, if you can do it, give it to somebody sitting next to you and have that reader circle what he or she finds to be the good stuff in your writing. Well, some of the kids held on to what they did because they didn't want anybody to see it. Others gave their papers. So finally, after all of this was over, the only directions I said to them were these. Now take the circled stuff and make it into a poem. And so they did. Poems came in. Teacher and I were reading the poems in study hall. I come across this poem. It has no name. I said, okay, some guy wrote it. To make our problem worse, 8 guys in class hadn't put their names on their poems. So the next day I went back in and I said to the class, someone wrote so well yesterday that if the Nebraska Arts Council in Omaha is still putting out anthologies of student writing, I guarantee the writer of this particular poem that this poem will be in that anthology, but I need a name. I don't want to put York 10th anonymous. Nobody. Bell rang. Last period of the day. I'm standing with my back to the class. You get to talk now. You get to say, hey, you know that poem? And I turned around and I said, it's yours, isn't it? Yeah. He said, that's mine. I said, come on down, put your name on it. He came down and he wrote Doug Harris. And I wrote York 10th under it. And he got halfway to the door and he turned around and he said, don't write York 10th. And I smiled and I said, what do you want me to write, York 11th? And he said, no, write York 12th. I've been in this class 3 years. I don't do no work. Here's a kid who hadn't worked anything at all. And so he's been in this sophomore class for 3 years. I didn't even realize they held people back this long. He's ungrammatical. And he writes this, Grandpa. He was 6'3" with old age carved on his face. He usually sat in a rocker, whittling a stick and humming a certain song. He was rocking one day until he rocked no more. Eyes and mouth I shut, stick and knife on the floor. So we're walking to the door of York High School. Hallways are clear. It's safe to be seen with a poet. And he was walking with me. And I think I remember saying to him, among other things, Doug, what I really like about your poem is the rhyme at the end. And he said, what rhyme? What rhyme? He was rocking one day until he rocked no more. Eyes and mouth I shut, stick and knife on the floor. So was. About a decade later, I stopped to fill up with gas at the interchange at York. Who should walk out but Doug Harris? I said to him, Doug. He said, yes. I said, do you remember me? Nope. I said, I was the guy who had you write one day and you wrote a poem. Yeah, he said, I wrote a poem about my grandfather. It's in my billfold. Would you like to see it? But it gets better. One of my former students who was teaching at York High School said that Doug Harris was one of 4 Harris boys who completed school. He finally got out of school. The other 3 were in the Nebraska State Pen. Wow. Wow. So it was Auden one time who, in a moment of great despair, said, poetry makes nothing happen. It may not, at times, and it may not broadly and culturally, but individually poems do make things happen. And they made a really great thing happen in Doug Harris's life. One more. Senior class. Campbell, Nebraska. It too is closed. You know. I'm standing at the doorway with one of my former students, a blonde young woman who was really gifted and very, very beautiful. And we have just been writing, and so we're standing at the doorway and people are passing out. And some jocks in their letter jackets come by, and the head jock, for the benefit of his friends, looks at this beautiful young English teacher and says, you're the dumbest broad we've ever had in this school. Gee. So I drive 90 miles back to Kearney saying to myself, I'm going to get even with this kid. In an academically respectable way, I'm going to get even with this kid. So I go into class the next day and I said, yesterday we were in the past writing about the past. How'd you like to jump into the future and imagine yourself 10, 20, 30 years from now? Well, they're all smiling, saying, whoa, yeah. One guy says, you mean we can get out of here? And I said, no, that's the catch. It's 10, 20, 30 years from now, but you're right here in the school, and this is the scenario in which I want you to write. You have just looked at you. You have come back, you have sat down behind your desk, and you are thinking about who you are and who you are. In other words, you're going to be a teacher in the school, and you're going to teach you. So what I was trying to do was to get the kids in the back row to turn their eyeballs around and take a good hard look at who they were. I'd like to say the whole row wrote. No, they didn't, especially the head jock. But I thought the assignment was so good that about 2 months later in Hastings, I did the same thing. And an 18-year-old boy by the name of Peter Rivenberg, Paul Rivenberg, they were twins, Paul Rivenberg, hauled off and wrote a poem that I would put in any anthology anywhere. Here's his Geometry for Beginners. I teach them my geometry for beginners. Pointedly with a flat-angled wrist, I guide them through their parallel lines, their points which are not there, and their planes which do not fly. They dream in 2 dimensions, probably in multicolor, probably in coordinated slant rhymes and broken rhythms, no doubt about their hippopotamus. They are slow to reach the book's end. They are afraid of the exam. I know we will not page past the 3rd dimension this year, but they don't, and they never read ahead. They'll have to let those polygon stars, those points of light, reveal to them a fourth condition, a premonition of other polygonal boxes. Now contained within their own geometries, they are free. And I, boxed within the star's four-pointed box, beg another coordinate for my mind, another cartoon for my soul. Wow. I tried to find out what happened to that guy, too. You know what they told me? Harvard. But the art of this poem is as good as the poem itself. This is no chopped prose. I mean, these lines go long and short, but the extension of the line is based upon the content of what the line says. This is the best free verse that you could possibly write. It's like the grandfather poem. Those sentence stanzas are deliberately shaped by a kid who is ungrammatical and wouldn't do any work. Now, writers young and old have many influences upon their lives. We write about who we are. We write about where we come from. We write about where we grow up. We write as we have been influenced by teachers or by good writers that we have read. Some people we may have wanted to imitate from time to time. Well, I'm going to talk in closing about three subconscious influences which affect all writers. And these are subconscious influences that we just accept. And unless we're very, very conscious of them, we just go on being influenced by them without our ever really knowing that we are as influenced. We are influenced as greatly by them as we are. So I want to begin with Darwin. Darwin had to be a poet. He didn't have an eye that was large enough to take in what we would call the world. So he did what any poet does. He said the world is like, or the world is, metaphor, and he went that way. At the beginning of Origin of Species, he takes a world picture which has been extant for thousands of years as something called the great chain of being, in which everything is ordered from God through the angels, through men, to animals, through plants and elements, in a hierarchical way. The commandment is to stay in your place, but to fill up your place as beautifully and as truthfully and as well as you can possibly fill it up. This is why the sonnet is the great glory of a world picture called the great chain of being. In the middle of the book, Darwin has had a radical change of mind. He decides that instead of having power descend, power is going to ascend. And so he describes a world picture which, for the better want of a better three words, would be the great tree. He has gone from something inorganic and hierarchic to something organic and transformationally growing. In the seeds of the great tree, to use something from Henri Bergson, the élan vital in the seeds is the impulse which gives every seed an opportunity to grow and simply continue growing, and consequently not only shape itself, but manifest itself in some kind of, well, I'm going to say complete growth, but for it, at that time, it is a complete growth. So we think of the Constitution of the United States. We think of the heavenly city of the 18th century philosophers. We think of something as strange as Marxist dialectic. How did Marx and democracy ever get together? Well, they got together basically through Hegel's triad. And so basically what is happening in something like the great tree is this thing that is growing, and it assumes a shape which is the result of a spark which is in it. For poets, we think Whitman. So Whitman writes the long line out, and he comes back, and he takes the next seed in the next line, and it goes out, and he comes back again. But in the last sentence of Darwin's Origin of the Species, he has changed his mind a third time. And why was he prophetic? When we consider that this is the middle of the 19th century. He says the world is not like a great tree, the world is like a tangled bank. The world is still organic. It's got all of these things growing. But these things that are growing are subsisting on each other, or they're strangling each other, but they're interweaving themselves in such a clotted, tangled way that the world that he had envisioned in the great tree is anything simple. It is extremely complex. Poetry. Think of the initial reception that T.S. Eliot got to the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, when people couldn't put the imagistic logic together. It just seemed to be something that didn't move in space. It didn't move in time. It didn't move in thought the way the older poetry did. Or think of something as different from Prufrock saying what he says in this love song to what Allen Ginsberg says in Howl. So the question then becomes, if we live in the tangled bank, and I think we do, anybody do his taxes recently? Right. I just discovered in one of my colleagues' offices this morning before we went to coffee that the omnibus book used in some English departments, edited by X.J. Kennedy and Dana Gioia, called An Introduction to Poetry, Fiction, and Drama, was 2,200 pages long. And the Affordable Health Care is 2,300 pages long. So the question then becomes, how do you write when you're subconsciously influenced by the tangled bank? You want to mimic the bank? And if you mimic the bank, you may write something which is as complicated, as complex as the bank itself. You may try to write something that has no relationship to the bank at all, that has no meaning. Or you might try to write something such as an individual that I know is telling me about what he writes. He said, what I want to do is I want to make writing the equivalent of something that you would see happening in the sky on 4th of July. I want to write descriptions which are so bright and explosive that people will simply read the descriptions and say, wow. And I don't care a whit about whether the poem moves from one place in space to another, from one point in time to another, and I certainly don't care anything about making meaning in the traditional sense. So I said, okay, you told me what you want to do in a poem. I'll tell you what I'd like to do in a poem. No matter how entangled the bank, there are those little bitty places called clearings. That's where I'll write my poem. You can keep squeezing me down and making me smaller, and I might have to write something that would even make Emily Dickinson squint. But I'm going to get the poem written in the clearing. I'm going to make a momentary stay in a world of tangled confusion. And so he said, good luck. And I said to him, well, good luck with what you're doing. So the older I get, the more I'm like, who was celebrated saxophone who played for Duke Ellington. He said that as he got older, he wanted less complexity in what he played, and he wanted to stick closer to the melody. He was 35 years old. Thank you. Rod asked me if I would entertain some questions, and I would be more than happy to. And for those of you who are sitting there saying, "Oh my gosh," you know, we won't go that long. Now, so does anyone have a question or a comment? Yes.
I was wondering about the fate of the Poets in the Schools program. What happened to it? I do a lot of work with teachers, and you know, now the NISA tests have very little to do with inferencing or imagination. It's all about comprehension. Is there still any kind of program where you can get
You know, I really don't know. I was in the schools for about 25 years, but could somebody answer that? How about Poets in the Schools? Hey, Twyla? Does the Nebraska Arts Council still have a Poets in the Schools program, or is it generally artists in the schools?
Yeah, it's artists in the schools, but there are a few writers in the Nebraska Arts Council
Okay,
programs, but
Okay.
it's not a Poets in the School
right.
program.
I think, you know, I think it's a really great program. And, you know, as someone who talks about having students in the schools, one of the reasons, but not certainly one of the major reasons, but one of the reasons I wanted to be a poet in the schools was I wanted to teach where my students were teaching. So that as a college teacher, I wanted to have, let's say, a map which actually fit the territory. I have taught over the years with a great many people in universities who give advice to teachers about how to teach in the public schools. But their maps are so wildly off that it's not funny. Yeah, right. Any other questions? Yes? Oh, I thought maybe you were waving at me, but you saw somebody better looking. Yes?
Any response from the jocks in the back?
Yes, what?
The jocks in the back of the room,
Uh-huh.
did you ever get anything out of that? Did you ever get back at that kid?
No. No, well, you know, I kept thinking maybe he's gonna show up at UNK sometime. I really get back in. But, no, I never got back at that kid, and, I hope he turned himself around eventually, yeah, but he was cocksure and very full of himself and convinced that all the other guys looked up to him, and they did, yeah, they did, yeah.
It was a beautiful story you're telling about your teaching, and the little subtext you get referring to about all the schools being closed speaks to the rural nature of Nebraska and what's happening in rural Nebraska. Forgive me for not knowing this, if there is an answer to this, but have you written a memoir that captures that story that you were telling?
You know, I haven't. There was a subsidiary, this shows you how old I am. There was a subsidiary of the Saturday Evening Post called the Design Magazine. And they did a story about me one time, and they called me that poetry guy. And that came about as a result of being a poet in one school. And I walked in the front door, and I had been there before, and some kid just let loose clear down the hall. That poetry guy is back again. And so this, I don't know whether it's even cataloged or not, but that's the only thing that I know about this. We did have a little booklet. I'm not sure who put this out, but it was either the Nebraska Humanities Organization, I believe it was. They put it out in, I'm guessing, the late 70s, and the people who had worked in the schools up to that time had an opportunity to write a little bit about what they had done in the schools. And so I think that's probably in the archives somewhere. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it was good. Edison, Nebraska, I was walking down the hall one day, another high school that had elementary kids in it. Looked up there, and one of the graduates was the first guy who played The Fugitive. Right. And there he was, 1920s, had his hair slicked back and everything. And that, on that very day, I introduced the kids in Anderson to the game called Kick the Can, because it was raining outside. So we got a can from the cook, we put it down in the jump circle in the gym, and then we got the janitor up to unlock every door in the whole school, and we could hide any place. And after I'd caught all of them, they had to catch me. So I hid in the trophy room and just covered myself with trophies. And I can remember that little girl coming in and opening the door, and she said to her companion, "You wouldn't be in here, would he?" And I just rattled those trophies. She jumped way. That's good. Okay. Oh, wait a minute.
Books.
Can I have one of your beautifully displayed books?
You, what?
You want a
Can I have
book?
one?
Oh,
Oh, yes. These books up here are two recent books of mine, including the brown one, which is a book of last poems. And you have to have the brown book because our daughter Erin took the photograph on the cover, and it is absolutely magnificent for someone writing a last book of poems. But unless you're a Billy Collins, or let's say a Mary Oliver, trying to sell a book of poetry in America is like trying to sell snow to the residents of Nome, Alaska. So all these books are free. If you haven't picked out a Mother's Day gift yet, they're there. If you need a gag gift for somebody in your family, take a book of poetry. But grab one or more on your way out.